So I think we're going to segue back into the standard benefit cost analysis world. What the next panels are going to be about is largely about the conventional approaches to doing benefit cost analysis, including the ways that people who are working within this framework are doing innovative work to help move the field forward. I think a lot about this as having a bunch of different toolboxes. We have one really big one that's called please do some analysis. I don't care what kind you do, just do some analysis. And then in there we have a box that says economic evaluation. We've got CEA in there. We've got extended CEA. We've got using social welfare functions. We have benefit cost analysis and lots of other variants. Right now we're going to move back into the sort of standard conventional benefit cost analysis toolbox. The goal of these presentations that you're about to see are to provide a starting point for what we're going to do next, because the next steps are writing these methods papers in specific areas. So for example, we'll likely have a methods paper that's on valuing mortality risk reductions. That paper will lay out the conceptual framework. It will include a brief review of the literature. We'll make some specific recommendations or maybe lay out some options of what should be in the reference case. And then we'll be discussing that paper in our November workshop. We'll be doing the same thing for non-fatal risk reduction, the same thing for some non-health effects. So what we really want to know from you as we walk through these presentations is, are we on the right track? Have we identified the major issues? What have we left out? Are there things that we should be talking about in these methods papers that we've forgotten about? Or are there things that we've talked about that are so generally agreed on that we don't need to spend much time on them in the methods papers? The way this panel is organized is I'm going to do sort of a general overview of methods and some of the issues. Maureen Cropper then will come and talk about some work she's been doing recently on the VSL, applying VSL estimates from the literature in a specific context. Then Trudy's going to talk about valuing morbidity, non-fatal effects, and Jim will talk about estimating willingness to pay per quality. I think what we'll do is we'll go through all four presentations. We have, we told ourselves we had 10 to 15 minutes each, so I'll let you maybe give us a 5-minute and a 2-minute warning. I don't know, whatever works for you. And then we'll open for discussion after we get through all four. This is going to be the view from 30,000 feet again. I'm going to talk very quickly about the basic framework, touching again on some of the things that Jim mentioned earlier. Then talk about valuing mortality risk, valuing morbidity risk. Unfortunately, a lot of these issues have already come up, so I can go through some of my slides very quickly, but I think it's worth pulling them all together in one place. So there's two key assumptions that underlie how we estimate these values in conventional benefit cost analysis. And I emphasize the word conventional. There's lots of ideas out there about different ways of doing benefit cost analysis, but this is sort of the core framework that we see implemented. The first is this idea of consumer sovereignty, that individuals are the best judge of their own welfare. There are places where we make exceptions, children, people who are cognitively impaired. There's been a big discussion lately about how to deal with addictive goods, particularly smoking, and what to assume about people's decision making. But the other thing is, I keep feeling after the last discussion that I should change all the words I've been using, but I'm going to stick with what I'm used to for now. The idea here is that money is a symbol of what you're willing to give up. If I spend more money on risk reductions, I'm not going to have that money to spend on other things. If the Gates Foundation spends more money on a particular program, they're not going to be able to use that same money for something else. So money is just a measure of the rate of exchange. The main focus of these two panels, although there's some exceptions, is on outcomes that we can't use market prices to value, or at least market prices don't give us a complete enough value for us to be fully happy using them in benefit cost analysis. There are a lot of things where we can use market prices to estimate benefits, but at least some of us perhaps optimistically think that the harder problems are around these non-market values. There's two methods that we use. One is revealed preferences. These are studies where you do something like take people's willingness to trade off job-related risk for wages, you control for lots of other things, and try and use that resulting data to estimate the value of risk reduction. Then we have stated preference surveys. We have many stated preference practitioners in here. The basic idea, though, is that we use surveys to ask people, or to elicit people's willingness to pay. We might ask them about a single scenario, what you'd be willing to pay in order to achieve a 1 in 10,000 risk reduction associated with air pollution. We might ask them to do trade-offs among different attributes, and then use the results to come to some conclusions about willingness to pay. It's always ironic to me that this is called benefits transfer and that people give economists a hard time about doing benefits transfer, because every area of research that you work in, I don't care what you do, you're always in this situation where you're taking the results of an existing study and you are applying them to a slightly different context. Even if it's a randomized controlled trial, the people who are in your trial and the people who are now going to be affected by the intervention are two different groups. So what I'm about to describe here is a framework that is used in many places other than valuation. I think that a lot of people give us a hard time for doing this and forget that it's common in all types of policy analysis. I describe what we're trying to value. We want to review the literature and see what gives us some insights into those values. We want to review the studies for quality and applicability. By quality, I mean whether the study adheres to best practices, uses good data, all those sorts of things. By applicability, I mean the similarities between, in this case, the risks that people are being asked to value, and also the characteristics of the people in comparison to the policy case that you're going to apply the results to. Transfer the estimates, and of course, address uncertainty. The two major challenges that I think we need to address in this area are that for mortality risk reductions, we largely have studies of people who live in high-income economies, and that raises questions about how to transfer those values to lower middle-income countries, at least in the short term, while we don't have valuation studies that have been done on those populations. The usual adjustment is just for income, but there's also obviously differences in age, life expectancy, but also in things like cultural values. So the question is, how do we do these transfers in a way that is at least as valid as possible? For morbidity risk reductions, even in high-income economies, we have very few studies of individual willingness to pay, and often use these proxy measures, including cost of illness estimates or monetized qualities, which we'll talk more about later. I feel like we've talked about the VSL definition a little bit already, but maybe I'll run through this quickly. Just the rate of trade-off for mortality risk reduction, usually on order of 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000, within a short time period. I mean, a specified time period. This isn't the value of saving somebody's life with certainty, although it's often misinterpreted that way. This just runs through the math in a very simplistic way, because sometimes it helps make the point that what we really care about is, in this case, the $900. These 9 million values are US, but what we really care about is the individual willingness to pay. We convert it into a VSL largely for convenience, because if somebody's doing a risk assessment, they're likely to come out with an estimate of the number of statistical cases that have been averted by whatever the policy is, and so we want a value that we can then assign to the statistical cases. We already talked about this issue. There's substantial confusion over terminology. So this first one is Trudy's willingness to. You actually all should read this article. It's called "Euthanizing the VSL." Is that right? In the also the supplementary stuff that Trudy's published on her website. But her proposal was willingness to swap. The US EPA is now undertaking a sort of a focus group type effort to try and figure out what terminology people actually understand the best. And I think, is this right, Neil? The value of risk reduction, the value of mortality risk are among the leading candidates. And then, as many of you know, Dean's been using the value of a standardized mortality unit, which is willingness to pay for 1 in 10,000 risk change. In a lot of the studies that we've reviewed in low and middle income countries, people instead use human capital to value mortality risk changes. And the slide is basically just a reminder that that's not an estimate of willingness to pay. I think there are good arguments for presenting human capital estimates along with a VSL estimate because it provides a different perspective, just like CEA and BCA can provide different perspectives on policy impacts. But it is not consistent with the basic benefit cost analysis framework. We've done some comparisons of these numbers and human capital estimates for somebody of the same age and life expectancy to a VSL estimate. The human capital numbers, at least in the U.S., can often be as much as 5 times lower, or factor 5 to get to the VSL. In terms of studies, we in the U.S. we largely rely on these wage risk studies because we have decent data. There's been a lot of work on methods. We tend to rely a little bit less on these studies that look at averting behavior, like wearing a bicycle helmet or obeying the speed limit, not because we think that those are bad ideas, but because we often have so much trouble teasing out the risk change from all the other things that affect those behaviors, and sometimes have to make fairly heroic assumptions to come up with values. We also see a lot of use of stated preference methods. I think we've got some of the leading stated preference researchers in the room today, so I'll let them talk more about this later. The idea here, though, is to instead use a survey to develop estimates of individual willingness to pay. Each of these methods has advantages and limitations. In the U.S., the argument's often made that we prefer revealed preference studies because they're based on real market transactions. But when you move into the low and middle income countries, you don't have the type of data that we have here. For example, we have the Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries that calculates the fatality rate in different occupations and injuries, and has the data is checked 20 trillion different ways to make sure that the injury really was related to the job. You don't have that in very many other countries. So I think that when we move into low and middle income settings, we're talking much more about stated preference work. Morbidity risk reduction, same framework. The value per statistical case, willingness to pay, we use revealed and stated preference methods, we use benefit transfer. But there just aren't that many willingness to pay studies. We've done some reviews and have found very little in the US. There's even less when you start moving outside of the US. So we often, in US analyses and elsewhere, end up using these proxy methods. One is to simply estimate the averted medical costs and lost productivity associated with the health effect. Those costs may be beyond the cost of illness. It may include other sorts of costs associated with reducing whatever the health effect is, or qualities and dollies moneties based on a constant. There's a lot of question, though, about two pieces of this. And one is, what should that constant be? In the US, we usually derive it from a VSL estimate. I've seen in the global health literature a lot of using threshold numbers and simply applying them. The second question is whether people really value a dolly or a quality the same, regardless of what the underlying health effect is, and Jim's going to talk more about that later. And that's it. Our next speaker is Maureen. Did I go too fast? I made up for all the problems this morning. Is that the
Okay, so Lisa asked me if I'd present methods that we used in a forthcoming Lancet Commission report on global health and pollution. And yes, here it is. And so that's what I'm going to do. The commission is headed by Phil Landrigan at the Mount Sinai Medical School and Rich Fuller, who heads an NGO named Pure Earth. So one of the goals of this commission is to value the mortality and morbidity associated with pollution. This is by category of pollution. So for ambient air pollution, household air pollution, unsafe water, unsafe sanitation, exposure to lead, and to do it in a bottom-up fashion, to do it country by country for 194 countries. The estimates of mortality and morbidity come from the 2015 GBD, from the risk factor analysis. So the gentleman from OECD who said this morning, nobody's going to use the VSL to value the GBD, that's what we're doing. And by the way, the reason why we're doing this, frankly, is, as Phil would say if he were here, to really get the attention of ministers of finance and ministers of the environment. In the GBD, most of the DALYs are life years lost. 97% of the DALYs attributed to various pollution categories are life years lost. So we focus on valuing mortality. And we realize, of course, that that's an incomplete measure of value, but of valuing the health impacts, but it's what we can do. So this slide shows you estimates from the GBD of deaths, both from the 2015 GBD and the 2013 GBD, associated with various pollution problems, grouped as traditional pollution problems, unsafe water source, unsafe sanitation, household air pollution from burning solid fuels, and modern pollution problems, ambient particulate matter, and ozone. And the reason I've showed you the results both from 15 and 13 is that what I'm going to be talking about are the results from the 2013 GBD, since our commission report won't come out until this summer. But these are the GBD estimates. We're taking them and then valuing them. And as you can see, this turns out these estimates come up with about, account for about 15% of mortality. And not surprisingly, when you look at the deaths distributed by World Bank income category, low, middle, low income, and upper middle income countries, not surprisingly, are accounting for the traditional pollution problems, but they also account for most of the modern pollution problems too, in terms of deaths. And you would say, well, that's just differences in population. But you'll see in another slide, actually estimates of death rates, which are also higher for the modern pollution problems in low, middle, and upper middle income countries. So this has been said now about 5 times, but we do want to measure rather what people are willing and able to pay for reductions in their risk of dying. And as the slide said, people are going to be paying for a cleaner environment. They're going to reduce air pollution by paying via higher electricity prices or cleaner cars and fuels. And even if we think about the traditional pollution problems, the sorts of problems that the Gates Foundation has contributed money to solving, I should say, it's a situation where there's going to be a trade-off between spending money on health and spending it on education and other objectives. So we really do want to try to get an idea of trade-offs people are trying to make themselves. Okay, you've heard this definition now, again, many times, so I'm not going to focus on all of the bullets on the slide, but just to say here, the only thing I'm trying to emphasize is that it is the value of a statistical life, with apologies to Trudy, is the sum of what people are willing and able to pay for small reductions that sum to one life saved. The OECD value of $3.7 million, which is based on stated preference studies, is what we take as the basis for doing benefits transfer in the commission report. So the 3.7 million implies that someone would pay $370 per year to reduce their risk of dying per year by 1 in 10,000. Okay. The traditional method of doing benefits transfer is to look at differences in per capita income, measured either by gross national income or gross national product. Lisa said that and it's true that there aren't many studies, but there are actually several dozen studies in low and middle income countries of the value of a statistical life. And these studies suggest if you actually set up criteria and you look at the better studies, they suggest that the ratio of the value of a statistical life to income falls as income falls. And so, we've started with, as was said this morning, you can take the European view and use this OECD number, which is approximately 100 times per capita income. We use various elasticity measures to transfer this to lower income countries, and the result, looking across all countries in these three World Bank income groups, is that the median ratio of the VSL to income is 96 to 1 in upper middle income countries, 64 in low income, it's 50. So as Dean was saying, Dean was taking 67. We're using different values for different categories of countries. And what this implies, if you take these numbers and then you express the VSL using market exchange rates to transfer it to US dollars, this would imply a VSL of $723,000. Again, these are medians for upper middle income countries. So a person in one of those countries, well, the median value there would correspond to $72 for the 1 in 10,000 risk reduction. In lower middle income countries, $168,000, so about $17 for that reduction. And in low income countries, $33,500, $3.35. These ratios implicitly translate into the percentage of your income you're willing to pay for this micromort, for this 1 in 10,000 risk reduction. And so, this is what they are. We think that this should go down with income because for low income people who are spending 30 or 40% of their income on food, the idea that they're going to be spending 1% of their income or 1.8% of their income, if we use the US value, doesn't seem plausible. So I'm going to show you two results, quote unquote, from estimating what we call welfare damages due to pollution by simply multiplying pollution deaths by category by the value of a statistical life for each country and then aggregating up by World Bank income group. The total damages from 5 categories of pollution that you'll see on the next slide come out in 2013 to be about 5.6% of world output. We also use the information in the GBD to calculate what the average person exposed to these pollution risks would be willing to pay to reduce these risks to zero. And I'll explain that. And that gives you, in some sense, a very rough and ready notion, perhaps, of an approximate benefit from an intervention that could indeed reduce risk to zero. Okay, so on this slide, which is all in billions of 2013 dollars, what you're seeing in the numbers themselves are the total damages, again, deaths times VSL, aggregated across all high-income countries, by pollution category. The first category is ambient air pollution and household air pollution combined, unsafe water and unsafe sanitation combined, and lead exposure. The numbers in parentheses give you that damage number. So, for example, for high-income countries, for ambient and household air pollution combined, the damages are about $1.7 trillion, okay, for the year 2013, which is about 3.5% of GDP in those countries. As you go down the first column, the percent, the numbers in absolute terms for the damages in upper middle, low income countries go down in dollar terms. After all, the VSL is lower in those countries. But when you look at the damages as a percentage of GDP, which reflects the fact that there are a lot of people dying from these under the risk factor analysis, the percent of GDP is actually much larger than it is in high-income countries. If you look at, and actually it's ambient and household air pollution combined that leads to the largest damages, both in percentage terms and in absolute terms. Not surprisingly, for unsafe water and sanitation, damages there as a percentage of GDP are highest in low-income and low-middle-income countries. But if you total all of this up as a percentage of world GDP, it comes out to 5.6% using these transfer methods. What this slide is showing you in parentheses in each cell, and here we've broken out ambient air pollution, household air pollution, unsafe water source, and unsafe sanitation. The number in parentheses is the estimate of the death rate per 10,000 associated with that pollution source for that group of countries. So 4 in 10,000 is the death risk associated with ambient air pollution in the year 2013, according to the GBD estimates. It's actually higher risk in upper middle and lower middle income countries, a little lower though in low income countries. And so, you can see the magnitude of these risks. You can also see for household air pollution that risk in upper middle, lower middle, and low income countries is actually higher than the individual risk from unsafe water source or unsafe sanitation. What the number shows, which is a dollar figure in 2013 dollars, this is actually taking that risk and multiplying it by the value of a statistical life. So it's giving you an estimate of, based on our estimates of the value of statistical life, what the average person would be willing to pay to reduce this risk, the 4 in 10,000 risk in high-income countries, to zero. Okay, there it's $1,373. Clearly, the dollar amounts are smaller as you go down the income scale, which reflects the value of a statistical life being lower. If you take a look at something like under low income and unsafe water source, the $17, this is a per person number reflecting an estimated willingness to pay of reducing the risk of death due to unsafe water source from the 5.36 in 10,000 to zero. So this is, let's just say, these are very rough and ready numbers. They are numbers that provide some, I would say, order of magnitude idea of what possible benefits might be from from associated interventions. Okay, we also do use the human capital approach. So Lisa mentioned that, and even though the human capital approach is going to be very much of a lower bound to willingness to pay, it's something that is typically calculated, and so we do that too. So what we measure here are the present value of losses in future GDP when somebody dies before the age of 65. We treat working age as 15 to 64, which is a standard definition in the international literature. Clearly, the present discounted value of future losses depends on the discount rate you use. So I'll mention what rates we use in a minute when we look at the results. We estimate the GDP per worker based on labor share of GDP. GDP doesn't capture all of output, especially in low-income countries where the informal sector is large. It also doesn't, capture home production and so forth. And of course, for people who die after the age of 65, this places no value on them. And for people who die as children, it's only in the future that their lost output is being valued, and that's being discounted. So, I'm probably at the end of my time. So I'm just going to say one thing about the next slide. And that is when we look at the damages, or the productivity losses rather, in low-income countries, they are still substantial as a percentage of GDP. So this is showing you actually, once again, by pollutant category and World Bank income group, it's showing you the percent of GDP lost due to that pollution category for the year 2013. And the numbers in parentheses are actually using a lower discount rate. The high discount rate is one where we say the discount rate is the rate of growth in per capita in GDP plus 3%. The low discount rate is the rate of growth in GDP plus 1.5%. And you're going to get larger numbers when you use the lower discount rate. But I don't know if I can point here. If you look at the low income row and the total column, you can see that the productivity losses here are between 1 and 1.5% of GDP in low income countries. I mean, that's not a small amount, 1% of GDP or 1.5% of GDP. The interesting thing is, if you compare that number, let's say roughly it's in the neighborhood of 1.5%. It was 7.5% when we use the willingness to pay / value of a statistical life number. So to echo what Lisa said, indeed, this is an underestimate for all of the reasons that she mentioned. So I will wrap up by saying that the concept of the value of statistical life, in addition to being used in the forthcoming Lancet Commission report, was of course used in Global Health 2035. And all of the methods that I've told you about in the last few minutes are the same as used in the IHME World Bank cost of pollution study, which came out last year. We worked together with Urvashi Narayan and Chris Sal at the bank so that we would be using the same methods and, I would say, speaking with the same voice. The human capital approach really will understate benefits and is not what economists would say is the theoretically correct approach. But at the same time, it's very important not to overestimate the VSL in poor countries. So there were some examples this morning of taking a $9 million VSL from the U.S. and transferring it, even using something like an income elasticity of 1 is something that's going to give you, in my opinion, great overestimates of the rate at which people would trade money, I'll use the word, for risks in poor countries. So I will end.
Thank you, Maureen. Our next speaker is Trudy Cameron. We'll be talking about value.
Okay, good afternoon. I do have to say that I blundered into health valuation stuff from ecosystem valuation. I used to be a recreational fish economist, but that wasn't important enough. EPA, on that basis, invited me to the Environmental Economics Advisory Committee, where I first encountered this thing called the VSL. Now, this is probably an interesting instance because normally we say chance favors the prepared mind, right? Well, maybe sometimes the prepared mind is sort of calcified or just set in its ways. So I came into this notion of health valuation for environmental policy benefit cost analysis. It's like, oh, how did they do this? And we had to review the guidelines for benefit cost analysis, and I got to the health and like, what? what are they doing? And the thing that struck me most about valuing health by the EPA was this focus, because the available data on wage risk trade-offs was that the main valuing life and death thing was sudden death in the current period, which you can describe as being squashed in the machine on the job, right? And there seemed to be a huge disconnect between that scenario, that future health profile of going from alive to dead, and typical environmental illnesses, which have very different characteristics than that one. Okay, I got to turn around because I don't remember which slide I kept in out of the 100 or so I offered. Okay, so this is a project done with Jared DeShazo, and grew out of that concern about this just being kind of weird, the way EPA was doing things. We sort of went back to first principles and thought, well, you know, illness and death are all part of everybody's future, right? It's in varying proportions of the available life years left to you. So we set up a survey. This is stated preference stuff. Survey offers a couple of scenarios. If you could pay for this program or that program or neither, which one would you like best? And we described each program as reducing a risk, but not of sudden death now, of a whole variety of different types of future health time patterns at different costs. And this is sort of the basis of it. If this was a sudden death now scenario for the rest of your life, it would go from no color to black all the way to the end of your life, right? And sort of environmental health risks involve primarily that green part at the beginning, some latency before you actually get sick from this risk, and then you're going to be sick for a while, and then you may or may not recover, and you might recover until the rest of your natural life, or you might die sooner either from this or from other illnesses that you're more susceptible because of this exposure. So we wanted to accommodate all these different kinds of profiles, and this is what you're paying for, to reduce a risk of not just dying, but all kinds of things. So I wanted to keep the flexibility to be able to model that. I'm going to scamper through these slides a bit. Okay, so when you do this, talking about private risk reductions, formal economic modeling, I was trained like a conventional economist. Willingness to pay, here in the sense of what you're willing to give up as opposed to what you have to give up. It's going to depend on people's incomes and their ages. Think of this as like valuing a health profile is a lot like valuing a car, right? You can't just say the car is worth $30,000. Different cars are worth different things to the same people, or the same car is worth different amounts to different people who value different features of the car, and there's no more reason why there should be one value of a statistical life than there is one value of a car, right? It's just silly. Politically expedient, but silly. So we've got this willingness to pay depends on this future profile of health states. And when you've got all that in your model and you're letting people choose over giving up some money now to reduce a risk of some very heterogeneous different future health profiles, you can value a wide variety of health risks. And the key thing about this as well is that morbidity and mortality aren't independent things that people are valuing. And if it's a health profile you're looking at, there's substitutions between sick time and lost life years and recovered time or pre-illness healthy time periods. And we do find that the longer you're sick, the less upset you are about dying when it's off in the future, right? Thinking about your future. So 11,000 odd choices, lots of people, stated preference survey. This is in the slides, it's too small. But so there were these typical choices, conjoint choice analysis with some attributes in the rows and some alternatives in the columns and lots of training. This wasn't the first thing they saw. The scenarios that we provided people were indexed by their age and gender. So these were person-specific scenarios that were not illnesses that happened before you're as old as you are now, and not things that are inappropriate to your gender. Lots of modeling. I'm not going to go through the details. This is just to assure you that we sort of flexible functional forms, defined what utilities defined across health states in each future year, and then it's a present discounted value of this future stream of health states. So there are discounted sick years, discounted recovered years, discounted lost life years. And it all goes into the utility differences, and the key term down there is a thing called alpha term. An alpha term can get pretty fancy when you use a flexible functional form, like basically a translog sort of specification that adapts to whatever the people are telling you and their choices, their trade-offs might be. And what you get out of this is this is one of the referees said, this is just a really ridiculously complicated way of calculating the VSL. And I said, no, this is not the VSL. This is all kinds of values of statistical whatevers, your whole illness profile. So we got a calibrated model for, at least for the US, across this range of illnesses and across the general population sample from Knowledge Networks, GFK. Any arbitrarily specified illness profile with whatever mix of future time periods in those bars for somebody with specified income and a specified current age. We can, within that range of possible illness profiles is the common one of sudden death now. And fortunately, our model benchmarks pretty well against that. And key results is this time profile matters. The type of person matters. Cars aren't all worth the same thing. Neither are health risk reductions to everybody. And this is, boy, that's pretty fuzzy. This is what comes out of this. Do I have a laser pointer? On this one anyway. The upper left diagram is the kind of picture you see out of sudden death now VSL type measures as a function of age. On the horizontal axis is how old the person is when you're asking them about these trade-offs they're willing to make. Vertical axis is their willingness to pay. This is per micro risk reduction, or if you multiply by 1 million, it was a VSL in the time period the study was done. So that upside down U shape was really typical. I was very relieved to see that in the data. But lots of other illness profiles are possible. On the upper right there, we have 1 year sick, now 2 years, whatever, I can't read my own slides. Okay, there's a different illness profile for the future, has a very different age profile of willingness to pay. This one on the lower left, I can see 10 years sick, 10 years latency, 5 years sick, then die. Well, that's something that could happen to you that isn't sudden death now. Very different profile of what people are willing to pay. And the punchline here is the last one is an illness where kind of things would happen if you got old, got emphysema and had air quality problems and died, got sick for a year and died half a year early. Right? That's sort of the end of life health effects. And that's a long way from an upside down U-shape sudden death now story as a function of age. So most of us aren't too concerned, especially in our middle years, about dying getting sick a year before our natural life and then dying half a year early. But that's really more realistic for a lot of environmental threats. Okay, we decided, so now I'm going to gallop through all the generalizations. You're just going to see the top of this. We assigned disease names randomly subject to plausibility. Willingness to pay does seem to be different across health risks. Results by age and disease. Okay, this is just the types of illnesses that were considered by all of our respondents. The yellow ones are above the average and the white ones are below the average. The idea of a given cancer premium is out the window if you notice that different cancers have different values for people. Subjective risk differences, we've got some differentials by whether or not you're a smoker that make perfect sense. If you're a smoker, you're willing to pay a huge amount for respiratory disease reductions and for lung cancer. If you're not a smoker, zip, you're not worried about that. It matters whether you're a parent or not. So to briefly summarize, if you've got young kids, you really want to pay to protect your healthy time. If you've got teenagers, not so much. You want to protect your money. And the story there is like the one interpretation is when you have teenagers, the possibility of being dead is less of a bad idea. But it's probably just that when you have teenagers, rather than spending money on yourself, you're saving money to pay for cars and weddings and college educations and house down payments and everything else. So your own preferences to reduce your own health risks fall for a while. Then they go up again later. Comorbidity. And this is a poor old guy with a walker and oxygen. There are these, the why bother story, or the dead anyway effects, the idea that as you get older, maybe your willingness to give up other goods and services to be able to afford health risk reductions, maybe the value to you of that spending on other goods and services falls if you're with a walker and you're not going to go hang gliding anymore, the other stuff you might spend the money on. Or it could be that I'm going to die anyway, why don't I spend it all now, because what am I saving it for? So there's some distinct differences there by a variety of subjective and objective health risks. And there's the famous age effects picture. This is how you get sort of let go as an EPA administrator. I think if you suggest that old people should be valued less than normal adults. Yeah, there's a lot of evidence that when people are old, they are willing to pay less for their own risk reductions. But when you're young and you're looking forward to being old, you think you'd be willing to pay a lot more. There's a time inconsistency in your age now and your age when you get sick. So there were some intriguing results of that. We can also use the model to back out something that looks like a time trade-off story. We've got present discounted pre-illness years, sick years, recovered years, and lost life years. We're looking at the marginal rate of substitution between things like sick years and lost life years and income. But it's perfectly feasible to look at the trade-off between healthy years and sick years, or healthy years and lost life years, time trade-offs. So we've sort of worked through the algebra of that. It gets a lot fancier when you generalize the betas to accommodate alphas to accommodate illnesses. There's lots, how am I doing? Oh, good. Then start changing gears a little bit. Those were all private choices about people's own health risk reductions. We had a whole different couple of surveys that looked at people's willingness to pay. This for public goods, right? A lot of health risk reductions are paid for by regulation, unfunded mandates. You know, sort of a lot of other people besides you, maybe including you, are going to be helped. You're going to pay. So you looked at treatment stuff and prevention stuff. Again, for a lot of the treatment literature in the health stuff that I explored was people are already sick. That isn't the usual environmental scenario. So this latency thing is a really big deal. Perceptions factor into both of those stories. Thought a lot about this in a paper for the annual review of resource economics that came out a couple of years ago. A couple of things that came up out of that was I couldn't figure out why it is that pharmaceutical companies aren't doing all the market research about how much people are willing to pay for drugs, right? To reduce symptoms, reduce illness, reduce risks. So I'm speculating, maybe you guys can help me out. Maybe they don't want to draw attention to the price attribute of the pharmaceutical. Maybe consumers never hear about drug prices anyway, if they've bought insurance at least. Insurance blunts perceptions of who's doing the prescribing. Or maybe if you did end up with a non-zero price elasticity, it would destroy the fiction that health is priceless. So there's that ethical, philosophical difference coming in again. But I'm sort of surprised that for-profit health insurance folks don't spend more time figuring out what people are willing to pay to reduce sickness through drugs. One of the things that did come up in this literature, there were a number of studies where people were doing drug willingness to pay for drug stuff, and talked about the drug itself. Given that you're already sick, what are you willing to pay for this drug? There were a few studies that also included side effects, and those side effects might look something like the illnesses you'd suffer if you're exposed to environmental risks. And those are prospective, probabilistic, not certain, and off in the future somewhere. We might be able, none of these papers did that, but you might be able to back out some side effect stories that looked more like what we need for environmental health risks. So decontextualization in the health literature, certainly important to reduce very heterogeneous health prospects into sort of an index that's useful. Economists do that by using a utility function, is the index attributes weighted by marginal utilities. The weights happen there. Okay, so where the weights come from bothered me for a little while. Apparently they come inside a proprietary black box in many cases. Okay. Marginal disutilities are kind of what the weights are. We know about that. I found a bunch of folks working in the health literature, particularly a guy called Norman in Australia, working with other folks. And he did a lot of breaking out the attributes of the illnesses, so just the symptoms and the time in the health state. But they always leave out the money thing because of this allergy to monetizing. And then suddenly, that's a bit of a problem. I'll leave that. Hammitt and Hanninger, like a student told me about this paper. How did I not know about this paper in January? Finally, somebody included price in one of those EQ 5D sort of assessments, and out of that comes some really interesting and potentially very useful stuff, I think. But it does outsource the formula for the health-related QL, HRQLs, health-related quality of life stuff. An econometrician would say you really ought to estimate all the parameters in your story as preference parameters. You ought to do them all at once in one big model at the same time, so you fully capture all the stochasticity that might be in the data. So this is sort of like let the quality type folks figure out the weights and get turned into a number of attributes, weight those attributes, and then look at the trade-offs. But this is progress, right? At least price is in there. Thank you. Okay, prevention stuff, prevention study. If you omit illness information, people make very different trade-offs. Is that 1? 0? Okay, there's more. In fact, there are, I think, about 100 slides at one point. I'd share those if you're interested.
Actually, I think the alarm went off at exactly the right moment, since we're transitioning from Trudy talking about Jim's gene paper to Jim himself talking about these issues.
Great. So thank you. So what I'm going to be talking about is valuing non-fatal health risks, and in particular, the idea that Trudy just mentioned of if you have estimates of qualities, can you turn those into monetary values? Jeremy. So three things I want to talk about. First, the components of value of non-fatal health risk. Secondly, the extent to which qualities are a measure of preferences or utility. And thirdly, the relationship between money measures of value and quality measures of value in theory and empirically. So three components of value. If somebody is sick but not dying, there are financial effects, which are things like medical treatment costs, lost income, some of which are borne by the individual or her household, some of which are borne by perhaps government or insurance companies. There's other time effects, lost productivity while you're sick. You can't do non-market labor, can't do it as effectively. You may have to spend time seeking medical care. These affect the individual and perhaps other household members, perhaps caring for the sick person. And then there's the pure utility loss, just the fact that you feel worse when you're sick than not. And there's so many different non-fatal health effects that the set for which we've directly estimated willingness to pay is a small subset of the total range of non-fatal illnesses. So that's the fundamental problem. And also this last bullet about these components may interact is the point Trudy made about illness profiles. The individual experiences at least the individual component of all of these things simultaneously, and the total value is not necessarily the sum of the individual values. So that needs to be incorporated. Okay. So what about the idea of taking qualities and inferring a money value from that? So I would argue, well, I would say that qualities are arguably a measure of loss of well-being. And they're pretty easy to estimate, so they're practical in that sense. So if they're a measure of loss of well-being and they're easy to estimate, you could estimate them, and if you could convert them to money, that would be great. So what about dollies? So dollies are not a measure of well-being. As I read the literature, they are a measure of health. They are designed to be incomplete and not a full measure of health. So in this sense, they're not relevant or not appropriate for estimating a money value of well-being. On the other side, I imagine dolly and quality rankings and estimates line up quite well. So they may be quite a good proxy for qualities. And then I want to say that qualities aren't a particularly great measure of well-being in the first place. So let me go into that. So the quality formula is, it's great to have Don Shepard here. Basically, I'll run over this quickly. Qualities weight time by this health-related quality of life, Q, which is defined such that Q equals 1 corresponds to full health. Or people say perfect health a lot, which I hate because I don't know what that could mean. Another ambiguity here is, what is full health for a 90-year-old? Can a 90-year-old ever have Q equals 1? Because every 90-year-old has worse health than at least the healthiest 25-year-olds. Some ambiguity there. But then Q equals 0 is equivalent to dead. Okay, so under what conditions would qualities be consistent with an individual's preferences for her own health? Here I'm drawing from a paper by Don and two colleagues some time ago. There are essentially two. One is the health-related quality of life associated with a health condition is independent of the duration of time in that health state, also independent of the health states that come before and after. Second, it's linear in T, or maybe the present value of T, but that implies people have to be risk neutral in T, or risk neutral in the present value of T if it's discounted. So for example, you would need to be risk neutral on lotteries on duration. 50-50 chance of being sick for 2 days or not sick has to be just as good as being sick for 1 day for sure. Okay, so the the theoretical work on this was published in 1980. This is a paper published in 1981 by Barbara McNeil and colleagues at Harvard Med School. So they elicited utility functions for people having to do with cancer of the larynx, where the treatment involved either radiation, which wasn't so good, or removing the larynx, which was better for survival, but impaired normal speaking ability. So the trade-off was longevity versus speaking ability. And they got these two curves. So these violate the two conditions I just showed you. First, you can see the curves are much farther apart for long years of survival. People would give up a lot of years of survival to have normal speech rather than impaired speech. If they have 25 years to live, they'd give up maybe 10 of them. If they have 5 years to live, they'd give up none of them to have full speech. These curves are also very concave, which means they're very risk averse with respect to longevity. So with normal speech, living 25 years for sure has utility 1, dying now has utility 0. A 50-50 chance between those two gives you expected utility 0.5. And you can see that's living like 6 years for sure also gives you utility 0.5. So 6 years is just as good as a 50-50 lottery between 0 and 25 years. Okay, there have been a handful of studies looking at people's preferences for risk on longevity. And the first one here was by Joe Pliskin, Don Shepard, Milt Weinstein, published in 1980. They surveyed 10 members of a Harvard Health Faculty Working Group, which is not a representative sample, but these are people who understood the question. And so there was no misinterpretation, I'm sure. And there was only one question. So 4 of the 10 said they were risk neutral in this question. 2 said they were risk averse. 4 said they were risk seeking. Since then, there have been several other studies with larger and more representative samples, generally asking multiple questions from which you can see are people consistently risk averse, consistently risk neutral, or whatever. And what you see there is between 50 and half and 3/4 are not consistently anything in these questions. A small fraction are risk neutral, and then the split between risk averse and risk seeking is sort of even in rough terms. So this is to say that I don't think QALYs, they may be a sort of reasonable approximation of utility, but they're not a very exact approximation for any individual. Okay, now getting to the willingness to pay side, if somebody's preferences for their own health are consistent with QALYs, and if they value incremental wealth more given survival than given death, in the event that they would pass the wealth on to their children or whoever, then their rate of substitution between wealth and QALYs will be a decreasing function of the number of QALYs at stake. So that's the theoretical result. We don't expect a constant willingness to pay per QALY. We expect it to decrease with the number of QALYs. Now I turn to 2 empirical studies, stated preference studies, one of which was Hammitt and Henninger 2017. The other one was a few years older, also with Kevin Henninger. But they're very similar. They were US Internet panels, Knowledge Network panel, willingness to pay to reduce risk by either some risk reduction between 1 and 3 per 10,000. In the first case, it was an acute illness where you would be sick for 1, 3, or 7 days from some sort of contaminant in your food. And so it's a risk per meal of 1, 2, or 3 per 10,000. The second case is chronic illness that would last a month, a year, or the rest of your life from environmental exposure. And here the risk was parts per 10,000 per year. In the first case, we described the symptoms and elicited health-related quality of life from the respondents. In the second, we described the illness using the EQ5D health classification system. We elicited willingness to pay. And what we found is that willingness to pay does increase with the expected QALY gain, but at a very sharply decreasing rate, which is potentially consistent with the theory, but it's saying there's not a constant value per QALY. So these are regression results from the 2 studies. The dependent variable here is log willingness to pay. So what's highlighted in red there shows the elasticity of willingness to pay with respect to the HRQL loss is on the order of 0.2 or 0.3, so much less than 1, much less than proportional to severity. And the elasticity with respect to duration is like 0.1. So if duration goes up 100%, willingness to pay goes up 10%, is what that means. And you could say, well, this is just insensitivity to scope. That's a big problem. We know that. But the top row is about the elasticity with respect to the size of the risk reduction. So 1, 2, or 3 per 10,000. And here in the chronic case, we got perfect proportionality. In the acute case, we got a coefficient of 0.5, so less than the theoretically expected 1, but way bigger than the others. So if you don't believe the results on the elasticity with respect to severity and duration, you have to explain why people responded better to these differences, small differences in risk reduction that they clearly have no intuition for, than the big differences in severity and for sure duration that everybody understands. So this is results using this. Here I have the top panel is the acute study, the bottom panel is the chronic study. I just chose different severities, the loss and health-related quality of life between 0.1 and 0.9, duration, essentially the minimum and the maximum from the studies. The willingness to pay is what you would calculate from our regression equations. You can divide that by the risk reduction to get the value per statistical case, the value per quality associated with it. And what you see here is, so let's take the top part, the 0.1 for 1 day, predicted willingness to pay is $1.36. 0.9 for a week, the predicted willingness to pay is $2.57. So the qualities lost differ by a factor of 63, 9 times 7. The willingness to pay differs by a factor of 2. So that's my point about it's nowhere near proportional to the quality lost. And that implies the value per quality is astronomical for the very short, mild illnesses, much smaller for the long, severe illnesses. The last two columns then are doing what is often done, estimate the value per quality from a VSL estimate, assuming the VSL is proportional to the qualities lost from the sudden death now situation. And so the implied willingness to pay you get from that is proportional to the quality loss by construction. So for the rows I was pointing out before, 3 cents for the mild illness for a day, for the small risk of that, $1.66 for the small risk of the severe illness for a week. And these are all using willingness to pay of $480,000 per quality. So you see down there at the bottom, the numbers on the order of kind of $1 million per case, $10 million per case for the really severe long-term effects are sort of consistent with standard analysis. But our willingness to pay for the very mild and short-term illnesses are much, much, much higher than you get from the imputing VSL estimates. So that leads me to these conclusions, that willingness to pay in theory is not proportional to quality gain, and empirically it seems to be nowhere near proportional. Is it possible to predict willingness to pay using some more complicated factor of qualities or severity and duration, as I've shown you? And clearly you can predict it better than you can by a constant willingness to pay per quality. But do we believe these values? And that was something I raised in my earlier talk, that sometimes estimates we get from people don't really seem like they are valid estimates of their own perceived self-interest. And maybe we ought to override these direct estimates and say, people can't really mean that. They really should value qualities roughly equally or something of that order. Thank you.
So I need two things. One is I need all the panelists to come back up. And the other thing is that since I'm supposed to be moderating, I need somebody who really wants some afternoon exercise to come run my Can you do one? I think we said we'd stop at 2:45. Is that right? We start at 1:15. Okay. So who wants to go first? Lou, you need to get a mic.
It doesn't.
Good, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to ask Trudy, and great discussion, everybody. It's real challenging to put all this together, but you asked the question, well, why don't people include price in these things? And, you know, I always admire the environmental economists because, you know, they estimated the price of the spotted owl, the preservation. I thought, well, if they can do that, nothing that I have to do could intimidate them possibly over in health, you know. But at the same time, the question we would like to ask in the healthcare sector is usually, you know, if we include this access to this technology in the future, you may need it or you may not, in your package, in your insurance package, what would you be willing to pay in the incremental insurance premium or taxes for the rest of your life? And, you know, and I think that cognitively people can't answer that question because the numbers are so small. And so that was always been my rationalization for why we do the workaround. The workaround is we sort of get them to estimate how bad they think the health states are. We get them to estimate the willingness to pay for equality. Then we multiply and we say, well, that's how much you value life. Then this is what you should be willing to pay for your incremental insurance premium. So I kind of view this quality thing as kind of a workaround because I can't do what a brave environmental economist would do. So would be interested in your thoughts on that.
I can wrap my head around qualities just about as easily. Yeah, and we have to be really careful about talking about putting prices on things. There was some discussion this morning that opportunity cost was price was value. Like, you know, if you're an economist, there are two things. There's what you have to give up to get something you want, and there's what you're willing to give up to get something you want. So it may be that the magnitudes of the differences are so tiny that people can't judge them, and if it's 3 cents, you know, it's like it's small change or.
That's essentially what I'm saying. It's a cognitive issue. It's not conceptually that's what we would really like to get, but we can't ask that question.
Absolutely. So there do need to be big enough changes to be perceptible, and for people to care about them. I could put in a plug for some cognitive attention stuff I'm doing with the same surveys right now, but I threw away the zillion slides on that. Yeah, so the behavioral stuff, what people pay attention to, how they process it, how closely they study it, how long they look at it, what patterns of access looking when they're collecting information upon which to make choices is a huge question. And that's one of the reasons why we have the scope test that dominates all stated preference research, that if you can't prove that people are willing to pay a different amount for a different amount of goodies, then your study has a problem. So certainly if it's 2 cents worth of stuff and it's, you know, 3 hours of misery 10 years down the road, we can't do that. We can't do that. It's just too small. So it has to be big enough to stimulate a response. And if people do respond, then you can say they're making trade-offs and you can study those trade-offs. But if it's too tiny, can't do it.
Hi, I have a question for you, Maureen. On the sensitivity analysis issue and making various things comparable, one of the original conversations was trying to make your Lancet Commission and ours comparable. And what I'm wondering is how you dealt with age. Were all deaths considered to be the same? And if all those deaths were people over 75, then if one were to have adjusted for age, you would get a loss that would be probably only a quarter of the loss that if you don't adjust for age.
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so yeah, we treated people of all ages the same. Part of that, I mean, we certainly could have done a value per statistical life year approach. I mean, you know, when you look at the pollution deaths, you've got a lot of, well, for water and sanitation, under 5 deaths. You have, for the other categories, you've got, gosh, like 3/4 of the deaths happening after age 65. So it really would make a big difference. You know, our justification in the report is, well, if you look at policies that are evaluated in the United States and in some other countries, it is sort of the Gates Foundation approach, that is, that all lives are equally valuable, at least politically. And so that's not done. I mean, it is done more in Europe, obviously. So we treated them all the same. It would definitely cut the results down. I don't, you know, if you were adding them all the categories together, you know, I wouldn't say necessarily to what 1/4 of what we have, but maybe to a half. Yeah.
So, Jim, the question I wanted to ask, you know, there's been this big debate, and fortunately we have Mike here to argue with you about extra welfareism. So, you know, extra welfareism derives a constant threshold. You know, we're going to maximize qualities from a fixed budget. We get a constant threshold. Seems like but then there's this whole debate that we should pay more for rare catastrophic conditions. Seems to me, you know, and that's been argued. There's a nice little blog recently by Darius Lakdawala arguing why that would come out of welfare economics, that you might pay more for rare catastrophic conditions, health catastrophic and financially catastrophic. So question is, this results that you showed about the kind of nonlinearity and complexity of how the quality varies, does that speak to the issue of rare catastrophic conditions having a different threshold, having a variable threshold for investment?
So I think so. It says own willingness to pay for change in own risk is at a higher rate for small risks, which could be the rare things. It could be rare catastrophic. Now, obviously, take VSL, right? We can all pay $9 to reduce our mortality risk this year by 1 in a million, but probably none of us can pay $4.5 million to reduce it by half. It's just the same phenomenon.
I'm happy to keep taking questions on the specific papers, but I'm also curious about the bigger picture question of, as a starting point for doing some methods papers on these topics, are we on the right track? Are there things that weren't raised by the speakers that we should be dealing with? Any thoughts on that? Or do we just all need to go get sugar? Oh.
This actually is about Maureen's paper, and I don't know whether it'll lead to a larger discussion. And it has to do with one of your conclusions that the human capital approach gives probably an underestimate of the value of loss there compared to the willingness to pay approach from pollution. But I'm wondering how that would look different in a developing country setting. I mean, I know you looked across all country, you had multiple countries, but when we're looking at productivity effects of non-communicable diseases, and we're using average wage in the labor market, along with some estimates from the US of absenteeism and presenteeism, et cetera, disease-specific health impacts. And what's troubled me is that it feels like we end up with an overestimate of the percent of GDP that's lost because of labor market imperfections, and just different ways that labor markets operate, and people operate within labor markets in poorer countries. So maybe I'm on the wrong track there, but I'm just wondering, what your thoughts are about that.
Well, first of all, I should be clear. I mean, because we were doing this for every country in the world, I mean, we said, look, let's try to attribute some share of GDP to labor, which we got from estimates from the Penn World Tables. So in terms of what people are actually being paid or compensated for what they do, that's a different matter. I mean, we were simply taking estimates of labor share, we apportioned it over people of working age because that's, you know, what we stuck with. We made assumptions about the rate of growth in GDP, but actually we chose a discount rate that canceled those out, you know, so we didn't have to actually make country by country assumptions. But no, if you're, you know, if you're actually trying to look at like lost wages for people in specific countries, that's a much more challenging task, and that is not something, unfortunately, we tackled.
I just wanted to say, so I don't want to get involved in the details of labor market imperfections and so forth in different countries. But what I would say is individual willingness to pay to reduce own mortality risk has to be, I think, larger than the expected value of the lost future income or consumption. So I think it's quite clear that a human capital estimate is a lower bound on VSL. And I think you wrote a paper about that some time ago.
Theoretically, yes, that's true.
So empirically, Lisa and I wrote a paper on income elasticity and extrapolating VSL across countries. And our read of the literature was consistent with what Maureen presented, that the income elasticity across country seems to be larger than 1. But if you have too big an income elasticity and go to countries with too low a consumption level, then you're getting to VSL lower than a human capital estimate. And so we use that as a constraint to say you can't go below the human capital estimate on VSL.
Okay, so I know I'm coming at this from a certain perspective, but when we're talking about the approaches, I'm just trying to think of motivating for the approaches based on sort of an intended decision maker. So where you've got a decision maker that says, I want to try and get as much health outcomes from my limited budget, then we say, okay, we've got some analytical tools, and generally that apply, you know, CA and that threshold. Just for these motivations, the decision maker who will be asking these questions, you need a decision maker who says, I want to make some resource allocation decisions based on the individual preferences of my population. That's if that's correct. So do we need to find a policymaker in low middle income countries who is making that statement, who is saying, I want to make a decision and I'm really interested, my main motivation is the individual preferences of my population. Do we need that as the motivation to inform these preferences?
Can I, so I actually think there's 2 nested questions there. And one is whether the overall spending on health versus other things reflects people's preferences. And then the second question that's nested within that is that is what's being spent on health being allocated right? And I think those are 2 separate questions. I also think that the point, I'm feeling a little bit like maybe I skipped over this too quickly at the beginning, although I think it came up another time. Every single person I know who does benefit cost analysis, and this may be true for CEA too, actually it's true in the article you wrote about the reference case, and all the guidance documents we looked at said this is an aid for decision making. There's a lot of other information that goes into decisions. And part of the reason for saying that is because we know we can't quantify everything that's important. Sometimes that's just scientific data. We don't have information on how exposure to a particular contaminant affects health. Sometimes that's valuation information. And sometimes it's things that just don't fit very comfortably within the benefit cost framework. Cass Sunstein's been talking lately a lot about trying to value things like dignity. You know, in theory, we should be able to figure out how to do a stated preference study to do that, but it's very difficult. So I think that, you know, I would see, if I was briefing a decision maker and saying to him or her, here's how my analysis is going to help you. What I would say is every benefit cost analysis I've ever done, probably every single cost effectiveness analysis that you guys have done, has led to a lot of insights that I would not have had without having done the analysis. And so I'm going to be able to provide you much better information. But there are some things that are not in my analysis that you need to consider in making that choice. It's not a hard and fast rule that's going to tell you 1, 2, 3, and 4 what to fund.
But I would answer this a little differently. I mean, when you look at pollution control, you're not looking at spending out of government money. You're talking all about off-budget expenditures. So the question is, for people in India, should they really require all coal-fired power plants be scrubbed, which effectively they did in December of 2015? There's been a lot of pushback and nobody's enforced that. But when somebody makes that decision, you could say, well, they just need to know politically whether it's going to go down. But it's also the case that you would want to know something about the health and other benefits, I think, in order to do it. I mean, that's what we do in the United States. We really justify air quality regulations by saying that the benefits exceed the costs, and the option of spending the money on something else isn't there. It's really, is the power plant going to have to do this, yes or no?
Hi, I'm Blythe Adamson. Oh, sorry. Were you gonna add more?
Why don't we let Trudy add it, then you can jump in.
I was just going to follow up on the point of the option of spending the money on something else. When these are unfunded mandates, sort of where costs are imposed on people because of regulations that they have to comply with, either them or the businesses they buy from or work for or invest in, right? The money it's not money, it's resources. Society's resources are there. And anytime you change an allocation through a regulation, somebody loses and somebody else wins. And you can't get around the trade-offs. You have to understand what trade-offs people are willing to make.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Want to go ahead?
Blythe Adamson from the University of Washington. So I have a question from an analyst perspective. So I'm imagining this workforce of health economists throughout the world, not just, ones like us in the ivory tower who can implement, these very complex methods. And I'm thinking about what if the story that comes out of, these complex discussions is oversimplified, and what gets communicated to, these analysts in Thailand and South Africa is that, okay, everybody, you all know how to do cost effectiveness analysis, so just multiply your qualities by willingness to pay, because Gates wants everybody to bring to the table, a dollar value. After looking at all the complexities here, what type of systematic bias do you think that would lead to in terms of the conclusions we might make? Or, are there specific illnesses or specific populations like, women of childbearing age that you feel like might be hurt or not be able to realize the full benefits if we bring to the table all these CEAs multiplied by a willingness to pay for equality?
Well, yeah, there will be distortions compared with the CEA answer, and which one is the more accurate representation of reality we could debate. But just on the mortality risk, if you value mortality in proportion to qualities lost or life years lost, that'll put, compared with using a uniform VSL for people of all ages, obviously you'll be putting more priority on saving young lives and less on saving older lives. And what I was showing in my work for non-fatal stuff is our estimates of willingness to pay for short, mild conditions are far higher than the monetized quality approach would suggest relative to willingness to pay for the long-term severe things. So, I kind of think our willingness to pay estimates are too flat a function of duration and severity, but it may be that qualities are too steep a function.
I think this question actually is a good one to end on too, because it brings us back to these methods papers. Because I think one question that we do need to deal with is whether we should be switching, taking CEAs, converting them to BCAs just by multiplying by a constant. I think there's a lot of questions about whether that's the right thing to do that hopefully we'll get to in the next phase. I'd like to thank our panelists, and I think there's some goodies to eat in the back over there, and we'll come back in 15 minutes at 3 o'clock.